Welcome to the University of New Hampshire School of Law podcast, where every week our professors give legal insight on important news topics. Learn more about the law school at law.unh.edu. Today we're joined with Professor Lucy Hodder, Director of Health Law and Policy Programs here at the law school, and we'll be discussing the work requirement for Medicaid. So just to start with, what is the work requirement for Medicaid, at least in New Hampshire?
Well, thank you, AJ. In New Hampshire, we have a Medicaid program, and we pride ourselves on being fairly innovative in our Medicaid program, as well as our other healthcare insurance products covering the people of New Hampshire. And so our Medicaid program has expanded to include adults who are between 0 and 138% of the federal poverty level. Many know that as Medicaid expansion. And New Hampshire did that originally in a public-private partnership with bipartisan support by offering these new Medicaid expansion enrollees coverage through the marketplace. Now, recently, the legislature, with support of our new administration in Washington, has been pushing to add work requirements to the Medicaid expansion program. And so New Hampshire is one of just 3 states who've had that kind of program approved by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. But there was a decision recently that has called into question whether or not these type of work requirements are appropriate for welfare benefit programs like Medicaid.
In that case, the Stewart v. Azar?
Yes. So, and we love to talk about current issues in healthcare here at UNH Law. I teach a class in current issues in the fall, and there is never a time when we aren't dealing with some groundbreaking lawsuit, groundbreaking decision, major shift in policy. You know, healthcare makes up almost 19% of our GDP, and in New Hampshire, it's been a real focus of policy and practice. So we are always looking at what's happening across the country. This decision, which is Stewart v. Azar, came out in July, and basically it called into question Kentucky's work requirement. So what happened in Kentucky is Kentucky early on said, okay, if we're going to expand Medicaid, and remember that expanding Medicaid was part of the Affordable Care Act. Just to back up, the Affordable Care Act was an effort to offer insurance coverage to everybody, regardless of where they fell in the income level. So for people who didn't have much income, the thought was you expand Medicaid for those folks. And then there were supports for the marketplace. And then people who were working had insurance through their work. So the goal was to get everybody insurance based on their means and their ability to work. So what happened is after a Supreme Court decision, states had to decide whether to expand Medicaid. And as I said, New Hampshire had a pretty innovative program and did decide to offer coverage to those with very low income. And then a movement came about to question whether or not people should have access to that kind of an insurance benefit if they didn't work. So I think there was some frustration, sort of more political than anything else, about this concept that there were people who could work who instead were getting free health insurance. You know, the other side of that coin is there are all kinds of reasons why people are not able to work, even in an economy that has very low unemployment. Some of it is due to mental illness, due to disabilities, due to lack of skills that match the work, due to a whole number of reasons, due to childcare or substance use or lack of transportation or any number of things can happen. So, you know, the other side of that coin is if you're going to provide people health insurance when they have low income, part of the point is once you have insurance, you can take care of yourself, get your health better, engage in wellness, and then move on up through the income level until you can ultimately work and have insurance on the job. So New Hampshire decided, all right, we're going to attach a work requirement to our Medicaid expansion program. We're going to make any able-bodied adult who isn't disabled, you know, didn't just have a baby, doesn't have a disability, we're going to make them work at least 100 hours a month if they are going to be eligible for this type of coverage. So it's important to remember that 100 hours a month is, you know, pretty significant work requirement, you can also volunteer if you want, or meet those hours through a combination of volunteering, school, and work. All right, so New Hampshire did that. We applied to the federal government because that's not allowed in Medicaid to attach a work requirement. It never has been. So we had to ask the federal government if we could do that. And we recently did. And the federal government, through the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, said, sure, attach a work requirement to this population. We think that promotes their health if they're engaged in work. At the same time, Kentucky had asked for the same thing.
With less hours.
With less hours. So New Hampshire took it a step further and asked for more hours and some other provisions that make it pretty tight. So Kentucky's work requirement was challenged. And there were a number of individuals who said, look, this isn't consistent with Medicaid. The purpose of Medicaid is to provide insurance coverage to people who can't afford it. There's nothing that says you have to work to get it. It's if you can't afford it, this is your access to coverage. And so there were a number of people who challenged the Kentucky work requirement and said, it's just inconsistent with the Medicaid. And the court agreed. So the judge basically said, there might be some health benefits in terms of engaging people in work and community volunteerism. And by the way, that takes a lot of supports to get people who wouldn't otherwise work. Yeah, it's not something you just
send people out. A lot of people don't know where to even look for volunteering opportunities even.
Exactly. And it's not as if someone who is home despondent, unable to, work, wakes up the next day and says, oh, gee, I'm going to go out and find myself gainful employment for under $14 an hour.
25 hours a week. I mean, that's a part-time job's worth of time. When you're already having a hard time, that's considerable. Someone's got to provide resources.
Exactly. So it was challenged in Kentucky, and mostly because it was challenged by people who said, "Look, I'm not going to be eligible for any insurance because I can't meet that kind of obligation. I've got a parent at home. I've got, things I've got to take care of. I haven't been able to find work. And so this is just inconsistent with Medicaid." And the court said, absolutely, you're right. There might be some health benefits to engagement, but Medicaid has one purpose. That purpose is to provide health insurance coverage and pay for that health insurance coverage for the people who can't afford it. There's nothing that says you can actually take that coverage away. And that's what the work requirement does. And so that's what the court found. Basically, threw the work requirement out the window, said that the Secretary of Health and Human Services didn't use his authority appropriately. From a legal standard, it was an administrative law decision. So that's for law students. That's another interesting aspect of it. Yeah. There's a lot of administrative law decisions coming out of courts these days, federal courts these days, and the judge basically said, you can review a secretary's decision under the Administrative Procedures Act, and in reviewing this decision, I find it was arbitrary and capricious. And so the court therefore overturned the waiver approval and sent it back to CMS. As good administrative law students know, that's what would happen is if you overturn a decision based on an administrative appeal, you basically send it back to the agency to determine whether they can make a finding that's more consistent with the purposes of Medicaid. So that's where it is. It's been thrown back to Health and Human Services, but everybody in New Hampshire is scratching their head now.
Yeah. When is our work requirement supposed to go into effect?
Very good question. So our work requirement is supposed to go into effect with our new Granted Advantage program that was revamped this year and is going into effect on January 1, 2019. So New Hampshire's work and community engagement requirement is supposed to go into effect on January 1, 2019. There's a whole lot of details that have to be worked out about...
In 5 months.
In 5 months, amongst many other things about who it really applies to, who is exempt, who has good cause to be able to get out from under that requirement, how it's going to be administered, where the supports and services for people engaging in work are going to come from. So the department right now is engaging in sort of a full court press to try and help make sure if it's implemented in New Hampshire, it's done well. But the federal Secretary of Health and Human Services, in granting New Hampshire's work requirement, used the exact same reasons for New Hampshire as for Kentucky, and basically said, it helps your health to have a work and community engagement requirement, and so therefore it's consistent with Medicaid. That's exactly what the court in the Kentucky case, said was not okay.
So basically, it's just we wait for further stuff to come from Kentucky, or is there some active movement within New Hampshire to nip this in the bud a bit?
Well, that's why it's always fun to be in New Hampshire, because it's never quite as clear as all that. So, first of all, around the Kentucky case, the rumor is that the Secretary of Health and Human Services has decided to reopen the comment period for the Kentucky waiver, which is from an Administrative Procedures Act interest, never been done before. Maybe not never, but it's a very rare circumstance. So they're going back, they're going to open it for public comment and presumably try and make some findings consistent with the court's decision. Simultaneously, the White House came out with a paper basically saying, we think work requirements are great and we should apply them to all non-cash welfare benefits. So housing, food stamps, and Medicaid expansion. So the federal administration, the White House, and its executive branch are not shying away from this concept that work requirements should be applied to all welfare benefits at all.
Which is kind of expected with a conservative president and Congress right now.
Yes. It is kind of expected. So there is this sort of ongoing political push. I think many of the advocacy groups would say it's sort of unhelpful to the population that it was intending to benefit, because this concept that they're sitting back, accessing welfare and not trying to work is just not true. That most of the folks who are on these kind of non-cash welfare programs are in fact working, or have many good reasons why they're needing sort of a bridge to stabilize their lives. So New Hampshire is in a slightly different procedural place, and there is a renewed application to extend the work requirement waiver to our new Granted Advantage program, actually about to be right before CMS. So our work requirement, it got sort of buffed up and cleaned up a little bit and renewed by the legislature. So our department has gone back to CMS to ask for a new approval around it. And the suspicion is that CMS will have learned how to figure out how to make its review and approval not arbitrary and capricious. So that's the assumption. They may decide New Hampshire needs to tinker with its work requirement. Again, New Hampshire's is the most strict of any in the country because it requires 100 hours a month as opposed to 80, and it applies to the full age bracket. So it applies to everybody in the Medicaid expansion program from age 21 to age 64. And that's not true of the other work requirements. They usually apply to those right in their solid, work years. So I think everybody's sort of looking to Kentucky, looking to CMS and the federal authorities as to what they're going to do. But meanwhile, pushing forward with New Hampshire implementation. So New Hampshire, because of the national politics around healthcare and healthcare coverage, New Hampshire continues to be an incredibly interesting spot for health policy and the many sort of political, personal, and policy issues that go into the question of how do we support people and how do we support their access to health insurance and health coverage. As we debate every year in my classes, the question in the United States is, do we all take care of each other, or is it every person for themselves? And how do we answer these really tough questions about providing social supports and something as important as healthcare? Because the thing about healthcare and the reason why I love health policy is that it affects everybody in some way.
At some point in your life, no matter what, it's going to happen.
No matter what, it's going to happen. And so how you access coverage and how those policy decisions are made is critically important to all of us.
Great. Thank you so much for joining me today. This is fascinating to see how this develops. And if people want to learn more as Lucy publishes any articles on things like this, please definitely follow us on social media. It's UNH Law on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and we will definitely keep up as she releases things for this. Thanks for listening to the show. Get the back episodes at law.unh.edu/podcast, which also has links to subscribe to the show on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and YouTube.